In this video, I want to talk a bit about the relationship between precept and perception-dependent learning, and also how perception-dependent learning relates to experience-dependent learning and stimulation in particular. And precepts particularly have to do with the transduction of information and components that are in the environment or body, and in some cases within the mind and psychological processes. But oftentimes we're talking about sensory-based apparatuses because it's stimulating the sense. Though we can have our mind influence perception, you actually see that often in the case of psychedelic use, where perceptions are influencing directly our body and our sense of the surroundings and our senses directly through how they're interacting physically with neurotransmission within the body and impacting our proteins as well as the hormones that are influencing various psychophysiological states. And actually, psychedelics are kind of interesting because, especially if you take something like psilocybin mushrooms, or if you smoke a bowl of marijuana, which has these psychedelic properties, especially if it's a bong hit, because bong hits are stronger, you'll experience what I like to call psychedelic entropy. And this is a high state of diffuse thought process and perceptual processes that really change up your experience. But over time, you move back to a set point, or you move back to an equilibrium. And what we're doing psychologically is we're trying to stabilize that high entropy state and often integrate it. And interestingly enough, psychedelics, and even in some cases cannabis, depends on your psychological stimulation, will actually activate the release of brain-derived neurotrophic factor, nerve growth factor, and improve things like learning and memory long term, and can actually positively influence well-being, which is an interesting thing to know. But it does depend on often this perception-dependent process and learning plasticity, whether or not you engage in that learning plasticity, which will take us to neuroplasticity, which is reflected more in that psychophysiological process rather than having that additional perceptual component, which is highly important for learning plasticity. And this learning plasticity is what we're actively stimulating and engaged in. Two different processes there, the stimulation and the engagement. But the stimulation, perception is necessary. It's a starting place for learning, and it opens up to learning. And where we get experience dependent processes is when we have an accumulation of these perceptual processes that are often deliberate, that encode information into memory and allow us to make long-term associations that are lateral and more creative and useful for various repertoires, and particularly these apparatuses for learning, and to draw upon various perceptions, motivations, emotions, actions, and behaviors to be able to master a subject, learn a topic, gather information and knowledge regarding various components within the self or the surroundings, and develop various levels of knowledge and expertise and even wisdom and self-knowledge that's associated with all those. And that often starts with our precepts and our perception, and they're two sides of the same coin you can think of, but they're also different, because perception has more of this, it's subjective objective, but it's primarily pertaining directly to the self, where the precept pertains to the self, but also uh, the mind body constituencies that are connected to the self and operate in relation to the self, but more have to do with the situated self and don't always involve the self directly. And so you can have a perception or a sense experience that we don't actually connect to the self or find meaningful or value. And so you can have these subjectivities that arise that aren't actually part of our self subjectivity, that form appearances, or that are part of the environment that we don't really want to associate with. That we can form these reciprocal relations, but we don't want to associate because it's not part of our meaning structure or value structure. And we don't really want to infuse our perception or motivation or emotions or feelings or actions with something that's potentially negative or harmful to us. So oftentimes this is done automatically without our thinking, and there's trivial aspects of the environment that we don't pay attention to. But in some cases we can have disturbances that enter our perception. It's very important that we develop a mindful as well as a thoughtful and a mindful, thoughtful approach to being able to form the relations and associations that we value and find meaningful with these stimuli that are occurring through the precepts, which again, this is something that's in relation to the self, and perceptions more intimate to the self. And that's all I wanted to talk about in this video, and I'll probably expand more in subsequent videos coming up on this topic. I hope you enjoyed.